No Hebrew scholar before Jesus or since Jesus has ever got original sin out of Genesis chapter 3. Not once, not ever. A fact.
If you're at the top of the pyramid, you are more likely to be able to jump over those obstacles than you are if you haven't got on the pyramid at all. So that I feel it's our responsibility as adults, as teachers, as parents, to help them move up that pyramid so that they are more likely to be successful in life.
Hello, welcome along to the show. If you enjoyed today's video, why not give it a like and indeed subscribe to the channel for more great discussions and debates from Unbelievable. You can also find our regular weekly podcast, our newsletter, and much more besides by clicking on the info with today's show. Really excited about today's discussion. Original sin versus original goodness. We're asking which view of human nature most helps children flourish in 21st century education. Katharine Birbalsingh is an education pioneer who founded Michaela Community School in Wembley Park, London. It's been dubbed the strictest school in Britain, but it has excellent results to show for it. Well, Katharine created a bit of a furore on Twitter last year when she tweeted that original sin was at the root of human nature and that children need to be habituated into choosing good over evil. Now, one of the people who responded to Katharine at the time was another education pioneer, Steve Chalke, whose Oasis Trust has been behind the creation of numerous academies in the UK. As a Christian, Steve believes the doctrine of original sin can't actually be found in the Bible, that we need to affirm the original goodness of humans, especially when we educate young people. So we'll be looking at this whole question, whether original sin, original goodness is the best way of understanding human nature, and talking generally about how we do education in today's world. So Katharine and Steve, welcome along to the show today.
Thank you.
It's great to have you both. Katharine, we'll introduce you first as someone who's new to the show. Tell us a bit of your background, what led you to found Michaela Community School, and I suppose what sets it apart in your view from other schools.
Yeah, so we opened in 2014. We're a free school. We're now full. Our first cohort went off to university just this year. So they've started at university in September, October this year. And we've got just under 800 children. We're in Wembley, very much in a city. It's what I've done my whole career, taught in inner city London. And what makes us different? Well, I'm dubbed the strictest teacher in Britain. In fact, I understand that if you type into Google who is the strictest teacher in the world, my name comes up. So,
What a claim to fame, the strictest teacher in the world.
Which is all a bit silly, really, because most of the time I'm in my office having meetings with members of staff. But why is that the case? Because a journalist came here once and said that I was the strictest teacher, and it's what the media kind of run with. I mean, who knows? But we are strict in the sense that we have silent corridors. We have very high standards of discipline. And, children might get a detention for small things like not bringing a pen into school. So, in that sense, we're strict. And then the other big thing I'd say is that we have knowledge in the center of our learning. There's a big debate about knowledge of skills and so on, which I won't get into, but we very much believe in explicit teaching, and the teacher being the leader of the learning from the front of the classroom, who is the authority figure, and that the children should then sort of follow the leader, as it were. So those are the two big things. We also teach gratitude and so on. We are a different kind of school. If you were to come here, we get 600 visitors a year, and people always say, gosh, I've never seen anything like it. So, and I'm always welcoming people to come and see it, because we are very different. And it sounds odd when you talk about it, but when you see it, you then get what we're doing.
Yeah. And in a sense, it could be argued you've sort of refused to bow to what you would potentially see as a sort of more politically correct ways of doing education. Indeed, generally, I know that there was a ruckus recently about comments you made on why girls tend not to choose to study physics. Do you think that there's a kind of are we putting expectations on children because of a certain sort of political ideologies, in your view, that don't tend to naturally fit their actual characteristics and so on?
Well, I was speaking specifically about my girls, specifically in the sixth form right now. So my comments were taken out of context, I'd say, in that particular situation. But But generally, yes. So, for instance, I would say when I say that the teacher should be the authority in the room, I think nowadays we're more inclined to want to sort of be friends with children, whether that's teachers or parents, rather than be that figure of authority. When it comes to learning, teachers are more reluctant to lead that learning, and learning is more child-centered. Now, I'm not saying in every school, obviously. I'm just saying that this is a general way in which things have changed, I'd say, over the last 50 or 60 years. And so we are more traditional in our teaching approach and in our approach to discipline.
Well, we'll come back to you to how this all plays into your comment on Twitter that caused so much interest last year. But we'll come to Steve now, who is well known to many Unbelievable listeners. You've been on the show a number of times, Steve. We always get you in on controversial topics of one sort or another. Tell us a bit, though, because you rarely actually talk about the work you do in education when you've come on the show, and that's obviously a huge part of your daily life. Tell us about the track record of Oasis in founding schools and what your sort of educational philosophy is there.
Thanks, Justin, and it's great listening to Katharine as well. Fantastic. So Oasis, I began Oasis back in 1985, and it wasn't set up for education, and it's not an educational charity. It has an educational wing. It has a housing wing, it has a community development wing, it has church wing, it has a youth justice wing, etc., etc. So it was set up for community development. Education, of course, is a really important part of that. And so I'm half Indian. The first schools we ran were in India and then in some African countries. And we worked in education here because you could get going back to before the Blair government, you could get grants for transition work for kids or kids that were at risk of exclusion. So we worked with schools rather than ran schools. But then the academisation process brought the ability to deliver schools in this country. And so I was asked actually by Andrew Adonis, who became Lord Adonis. He ran the Academies programme for Tony Blair and by Tony Blair. It's very small, and there were only ever going to be 40 academies, as I remember it. And I was asked if we'd do one of those. We now run 52 schools, so we've got 32,000 children, students, and we're building several other schools at the moment. And importantly, I think for this discussion as well, I think that we're going to develop something which is called the secure school. So Britain's going to have a secure school for the first time. It's an alternative to a jail. We have the worst reoffending rates in Western Europe. We spend more money on correctional facilities than anywhere else in Western Europe, and just dreadful outcomes. And so there's some law going through Parliament which may even achieve what's called royal assent this very day. It's been going through a long time, which will mean that Oasis can run a secure school. So it'll have a slightly different admissions policy. Our admissions policy wherever we work is how close is your front door to our school front door. But this admissions policy will be, have you been sentenced by a judge to a custodial sentence for a serious violent crime? That will be our...
Well, that's a different kind of... school for sure. And overall, whatever the nature of the specific school is or the context, what's the sort of ethos that you bring to that? Why? I mean, these aren't quote unquote Christian schools per se, but what's the Christian ethos, if you like, that underlies what you do?
Yeah, they're driven by what we always call the Christ-centered ethos. They're not Christian schools, as you say, because Christian school it carries, these labels carry lots with them, and by Christian school people normally mean you're more likely to be able to book a place in it if your parents go to church, that kind of thing. So we exist simply to serve the communities in which we work. It's just about how close you live and various other criteria to do with looked after children, etc., etc. But our ethos is all about community. So working with children, with their mums, with their dads, with their grandparents. So where we run schools, we tend to develop lots and lots of other community work. So legal advice, debt advice, food banks, youth work, community work, employment projects, etc., all sorts of things.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's a really helpful introduction to both of what you've been doing on an educational front. But we're going to be talking about sort of the ethos of human nature, what kind of particular view of human nature is the best one to sort of bring into that whole field, what makes sense of the way we should then educate children. And this is just one way into it, this kind of tweet that caused controversy last year, Katharine. But and we won't sort of dwell too long on the specifics of the tweet, but I will just, for those who aren't aware of what happened, just spell it out. So I think it was in maybe October or November last year, someone tweeted, "We are all born bad, and that's why it is so important to be morally educated and not just conditioned." And you just sent, I'm sure what was just the work of a few seconds, Katharine, as a response. You said, "Exactly, original sin. Children need to be taught right from wrong and then habituated into choosing good over evil. That requires love and constant correction from all the adults in their lives over years," capitalized. "Moral formation is a good thing." Well, you had lots of response to that tweet, including Steve, who as you say, Steve, you weren't sort of there to kind of rail on Katharine, but you were there just to be part of this debate going on Twitter. You said, "On the debate started by Katharine, the idea of original sin offers a deeply flawed view of children. The Bible starts with the idea of humanity's original goodness. God sees all that is made and comments, 'It is very good.' The phrase original sin is not used in the Bible." Now, Katharine, maybe we'll start with you. What were you wanting to express? Because, and it's worth saying at this point, you don't consider yourself you're not a Christian per se, but you obviously wanted to use this idea of original sin to kind of spell something out about human nature and the way that you think we interact. So what was going on with that tweet originally?
Yes, well, I didn't think I was saying anything particularly controversial. It's sort of like saying Merry Christmas when you're not necessarily a Christian. And I have to say it's quite interesting, this idea that Steve is putting forward, that Christians don't believe in original sin. I would suggest that the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church and the Protestant Church, that they all do believe in original sin. Now, obviously, individual Christians might decide to do things slightly differently. And when we say, what is original sin? I mean, why did I choose it? Because it's 2 words and you're on Twitter and you have you don't have that much space, do you? I could have said man is flawed. It takes a little bit more space. And when I say man is flawed, what do we mean by that? The last 2.5 months, I've given up sugar, and you don't understand how much sugar I used to eat. I wake up in the morning and I would eat chocolate biscuits. I would eat chocolate all day long. I mean, I just would eat sugar constantly because it's really, really good. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to give it up. And somehow, I feel like it's a miracle. I've managed to give it up. Now, I had to do it during February half term because I knew that I would have to sleep a lot. I would have difficulty focusing. It was going to be really, really hard. And I managed it. And even now, 2.5 months later, I still dream of sugar. And I still, talking about it now, I think, oh gosh, I could go next door to the office next door and they have cookies there and I could have one. And I have to work really hard not to do so.
I have a very similar relationship to coffee, I'll admit.
Okay. And going to the gym is hard. There are all kinds of things that are hard. And they tend to be the stuff that's good, that's hard. And the stuff that's bad, sitting on the sofa, not going to the gym, not doing your homework, not making much of an effort in whatever it is, that's all much easier. So that's what I mean by man is flawed. It's much easier to do the bad stuff than it is to do the good stuff. And in order to do the good stuff, you have to put a lot of effort in. So in order for me to get to the point of being able to have given up sugar in a more permanent basis, and I hope it's permanent, it's funny, when I speak to people and I say, I've given up sugar, they say, how long? And when I say, oh, it's been 4 weeks, it's been 6 weeks, come back and talk to me in 8 months. That's what they say, right? And that's because they know that man is flawed. And so he's likely to fall at any point along the journey of trying to achieve that thing that's good. And so I've managed to do it for 2.5 months and I'm going, hooray, hooray. And I can't wait till I feel like I've got to the point where actually it's a permanent thing. So, and it's the same with children. It's a habit that you want to try and teach them. So turning up to school with all your equipment. That's something that's hard to do. It's much easier to be disorganized, not check your bag at night, not check your pencil case, and then you turn up to school with whatever, anything that's in there. In order to learn that habit, that's what I said in the tweet, it takes years. In the same way as people say to me about the sugar, yeah, come back to me in 8 months. They're saying, how long can you do this for? So it's by doing the thing that's good, bringing in the correct equipment, turning up on time, doing your homework, that sort of thing. You do it over and over for years until eventually it becomes just part of who you are. So you are, and that's what I want. I want to get to the point where I'm not somebody who thinks about sugar. I'm just the kind of person who doesn't eat it. And it's the same with children. I want my children to leave us when they leave at the end of their school career to be the kinds of people who always turn up to the job interview on time, who always turn up to the job interview prepared with the right equipment, who are able to perform, not because they're having to remind themselves, okay, remember to pack your bag, remember to have all the right things. They don't have to think like that. It's just who they are.
And you say human nature it does not naturally propel us in that direction. We naturally will be sort of lazy. We naturally will be disorganized. It's something we have to learn. So to that extent, you used original sin as a kind of way of describing that the human nature is not kind of naturally yeah.
Otherwise, it'd be really easy for me to give up sugar.
Yeah.
And it's not. It's really hard.
So in that sense, Steve, I guess Katharine wasn't necessarily using it in a terribly theological sense, but just to describe that a kind of a propensity in human nature. I mean, do you agree with that general kind of, way of thinking of it? And obviously, feel free to talk about the way you don't think it does necessarily apply in a Christian framework.
The first thing to say, Justin, is I realised all of that of Katharine's original tweet, which I think I found. I'm not even sure I ever saw Katharine's original tweet. I just saw all this stuff that was going on around it.
Yes. And
proponents of the doctrine of original sin, which I guess Katharine didn't know about, because I knew that Katharine's background wasn't to be part of the church, and this whole thing about total depravity, which you'll know about. Original sin, Katharine, is a particular doctrine that was put forward by a theologian called John Calvin, who I'm sure you've heard of, 16th century theologian, who was particularly legalistic. In fact, he was a lawyer, and he had a very pessimistic view of human nature. And he said that we are all born into total depravity, that there is nothing good within us. That he said that we sin because we are born as sinners, and we're all linked to Adam, who sinned, and because he fell, I'd say Adam stumbled, like we all stumble, like Katharine's just talked about stumbling, slipping and sliding a bit. But because Adam fell, we are all born in total depravity, and there is nothing good that remains within us, and that we are therefore all under the wrath and the judgment of God and condemned to die and burn in hell forever. That is the doctrine of original sin, and that only those who turn to Jesus Christ and pray a prayer of repentance can be then thought by God to be redeemed. The blood of Jesus and his death on the cross covers up our sin and removes our sinner nature, and therefore we can be redeemed. In fact, Calvin, I'm probably saying this more to you, Katharine, than Justin, who I'm sure knows all these things. Calvin had 5 points to his doctrine, and it gets called tulip. And the first thing, he believed that all human beings are totally deprived, without a fragment of good within them. Then he believed that's the T of tulip. The U is unconditional election. If God chooses you, if you win the lucky dip and God chooses you, you will be redeemed. There's nothing you can do to stop God redeeming you if you're chosen. But if you're not chosen, then there's nothing can be done for you. And the very fact, Katharine, that you've said you're not a Christian, some would say that's because God didn't choose you. From before you were born, in fact, this is exactly what Calvinists say, from before you were born, you were not one of the elect, not one of the chosen, and you are stuck in your sin and the judgmental God breathes his anger out of you.
I mean, maybe it's because I wasn't chosen that I'm having such difficulty giving up sugar. I don't know.
And then I should just run for it all. So tulip is total depravity, unconditional election of those who get chosen, limited atonement. You see, it's limited only for the some, and others aren't in the some. Irresistible grace is the I. If you're chosen, you can't resist it, and you're going to be forgiven by Jesus. You'll become a Christian and you'll inherit heaven. If you're not chosen, tough luck. And the last one, the P of tulip, is what's called perseverance of the saints, which means once saved, always saved. If I've said a prayer and I've been forgiven because I'm one of the elect, whatever I do after that, I'm forgiven. And I'm saying, and I've always said, this is all nonsense. And I think it's condemning and angry and judgmental, and not the Bible's view of humanity. In fact, of course, Justin, because I'm a Christian, I'm a Baptist minister, it's my theology that propelled me into engagement in education and working with young people, which I've done all my life. And it's because of my theology that we're propelled into launching an alternative to a youth jail, because I believe that everyone is, I believe what Catherine's just said, actually, we are created good. And the Bible begins with Genesis chapter 1, not Genesis chapter 3, which is the story of Adam and Eve and what gets called the fall. But I'd simply say this, that Genesis begins with chapter 1, and God's looked at everything he made, every man, every woman, every child, and said, it is very good. Genesis chapter 3, the story of Adam and Eve, of course, isn't a piece of history. It's a myth. It's a fable. It's as is widely understood. Adam isn't a name. Eve's not a name. It means first man and first woman in Hebrew. And there is no devil. So the doctrine goes, the devil tempts Eve into eating an apple. She gives it to Adam, and God condemns them because of their disobedience. It's a parable, and it's a parable about how it's easy to satisfy our appetites. Exactly what you're saying, Katharine. It's easy to go for the sugar. It's easy to go for the fruit off the tree, which was probably a pomegranate, not an apple. And it's easy to go for the low-hanging fruit, and it's hard to make the right moral choices. That's what the parable's about.
Now I haven't brought Katharine on here to debate the theology necessarily of Genesis 1 to 3, and I'm aware that if I had another Calvinist Christian on, Steve, they would obviously disagree with much of what you've said, but we'll leave that. But is there anything you do want to respond to in what Steve said there, Katharine?
Well, I mean, it's fascinating. I didn't know any of this. I mean, well, I could just say I certainly wasn't saying all of that.
Yeah, and I knew that. I
was just saying, we have a hard time going to the gym, or we have a harder time doing our homework. I mean, it's fascinating what you're saying, though, the whole chosen bit, because I thought the whole point of Christianity was that everyone can be redeemed, as it were, that God will accept anyone into heaven, but you need to try and be a good person, and you need to believe in Jesus Christ, and you need to, I don't know, go to church and all that sort of thing. I mean, no, isn't anyone redeemable? Isn't that the whole point about Christianity?
My view of theology is that God is love, and God loves all. And God created every man and every woman and every child, as Genesis 1 says, that every child in your care, Katharine, every child in my care and the care of Oasis staff, their life is of infinite worth and value. Yeah.
Yes, that's what I've always understood Christians to be saying.
But Calvinism does not say that. And that's what I was saying. Let me just say this, Justin, then we move on. It's worth saying, put it down on this tape or whatever it is we're recording this on. No Hebrew scholar before Jesus or since Jesus has ever got original sin out of Genesis chapter 3. Not once, not ever. A fact. Not one Hebrew scholar would say Genesis chapter 1 is about, chapter 3 is about original sin. They'd say other things, and you might want me to explain what those are. But you may...
Well, let's let Katharine respond, and then we'll move to a break.
I mean, honestly, you're teaching me stuff here. I mean, what are you saying that all these Christians who do believe in original sin have been influenced by Calvin, and they're wrong because actually the Bible doesn't believe in original sin? It's just that Calvin has taken them down the wrong route, and that all those Christians are wrong about Christianity. Is that what you're saying?
Well, do you know, Christians take different stances around all sorts of things. There are many Christians that stand against the inclusion of gay people in the Christian community. I happily marry people of the same sex. Our churches, we run several churches, have lots of people who are lesbian or gay or trans people within them. So Christians have different views about different things. But yes, I am saying that Calvinist teaching, the teaching of original sin, which didn't start with Calvin actually, it's often said there was a former theologian called St. Augustine of Hippo, and it's often said that Augustine took the worst misunderstandings of the Apostle Paul, and then Calvin took the worst bits of Augustine and came up with this concept of original sin, which condemns some people to hell before they were ever born. And I'd love to talk to you about hell and all that.
Well, I tell you what, I don't want us to get too distracted by hell, Calvinism, theology, because I'd love to talk about education as well. And we're going to go to a quick break before we do that. I will say, Steve, obviously, I'm sure lots of listeners would love to respond to you on some of the issues you've raised there, but that's not the show that we're doing today. So maybe we'll get you back for a debate with the
Let's do another show about whether the Bible teaches original sin.
Yeah. But also ultimately, as you say, I mean, Calvin had his view on original sin, but obviously the Catholic Church, as Katharine has said, has held to a view of original sin that stems more from Augustine, as you say. But we will go to a break.
Yeah, could I say one last thing, though, Justin? But Katharine, when you said that the Protestant Church, the Catholic Church, and the Orthodox Church all believe in original sin, the Orthodox Church never did.
Oh, really?
Okay. But having said all that, Katharine, even if people don't subscribe to full-blooded Calvinism, there's still plenty of people who do in the Christian church who would subscribe to something like original sin, more in the sense that you meant it, I suspect, not in some kind of passed down sexually through generation to generation as perhaps St. Augustine meant, but yeah.
Aristotle, before Christianity, talked about acquiring virtue. I mean, the people who aren't Christians like me believe in the idea that man is flawed and that we need to teach children how to behave well, how to share, how to not hit the other toddler when they've taken your toy and all that sort of thing, you know?
Well, we'll go to that break I've been promising, and then we'll come back to talk about this. Okay, here we go. You're listening to Unbelievable. Going to have an interesting discussion today on, human nature, original sin, original goodness, what best explains the way we should educate and help children to flourish in 21st century education. Katharine Birbalsingh and Steve Chalke are my guests on the show today. We'll be back in just a moment. Can you hear me? Is this working? We've all got used to muting and unmuting ourselves in recent years, but in our confused and divided culture, when Christians feel nervous about speaking up, it feels like God has been put on mute too. Well, this May, Premier Unbelievable the Conference is coming live from the British Library London as leading thinkers help the church and you to find your authentic voice again. Alistair McGrath, John Wyatt, Lisa Fields, Glenn Scrivener, Sharon Dirks, Joseph D'Souza, Phil Vischer, Skye Jitani and more guests will show how Christians can speak with truth and grace in troubled times. Plus, there'll be the global launch of our brand new ministry, helping skeptics to explore faith and Christians to share their faith with confidence. Not only that, your ticket includes our live Big Conversation event with renowned brain psychologist Ian McGilchrist and Christian neuroscientist Sharon Dirks on whether there's a master who made our mind. You can attend in person or online from anywhere in the world. So join me, Justin Brierley, on Saturday the 14th of May for this year's conference. Find out more at unbelievable.live and let's take God off mute. Welcome back to today's show. We're talking about human nature, original sin versus original goodness. Katharine Birbalsingh is an educational pioneer. She's founded the Michaela Community School in Wembley Park, London. She's been talking about why she's been dubbed the strictest head teacher in the world, possibly. But it's essentially a kind of what could be said a no-nonsense kind of approach to education, getting back to more traditional kind of views about teacher-pupil relationships and that sort of thing. Steve weighed in on a debate that Katharine started on the question of human nature. Original sin was the way she put it. Now, we've talked a bit about the theology of that, but let's talk about kind of, I suppose, the way in which, Katharine, you see that there's this fundamental flaw at the heart of humans, that we're naturally inclined to do evil, to skip doing, the hard things, the good things. And as you said, this isn't an idea exclusive to Christianity necessarily. Lots of people down the ages have recognised that. And to that extent, how does that inform sort of the way you approach children's education? Do you kind of basically see a child in front of you, as it were, who is someone who needs to be taught how to be a good person? They're not naturally good in that way. Or you're holding up something for the camera here. Tell us what this is.
So this is our pyramid that we use. And so first you need to get on the pyramid. That's what we say to the children. And then the idea that for any different characteristic, whether it's being on time or doing your homework or being kind to people or whatever it is, you want to try and move to the top here. So at the bottom, you do the right thing because you want to avoid a demerit or a detention. So that's what the detention's used for. So you think, oh gosh, I better do my homework because otherwise I'm going to get a detention. Well, that's good because that means you're on the pyramid. Because if you're not on the pyramid, you think, I don't care, give me a detention, makes no difference. So you get there. Then on top of that, you're going further up. Actually, you don't just care about avoiding the detention. You actually want to get the merit. Oh yeah, if I do really good homework, I'm going to try my best on this because then I'm going to get a merit. Then it's up here. Well, actually, I want my teachers to respect me. I have a relationship. I don't want to let them down. So then you're further up. Up here, you get the connection between doing really well at your homework and having a great future. And up here, which is where you want to get all your kids for all the characteristics, it's just who you are. So eventually, you've done homework every night. At first, you started doing it because, well, you would get a detention. But eventually, when you leave us, you are just the kind of person who always does your homework and you don't even think about it. And
in a sense, this pyramid, which results in this kind of natural sort of doing the right thing without really having to think about it, is this kind of, does this contravene what is sometimes the view of human nature and psychology, that actually we're basically good. We start at the top of the pyramid, but it's outside forces that force us down to sort of being people who don't care or who don't get good grades or whatever. Because very often what I see in that you seem to be responding to, sometimes at least, Katharine, is the idea that we're all victims of our circumstances and that we'd all be flourishing if it weren't for the injustices and the privilege and the everything that's, and you seem to be responding to that and saying, no, let's not blame all the circumstances around us. There's something wrong in the core of us. And yes, of course, there are circumstances that make life more difficult for people, but let's not ignore the fact that we're not good to start with. In a sense, we have to learn how to be good. Is that a fair summary, Katharine?
I mean, I'd say it's, when you say there's something wrong, I don't think that there's, to myself, I don't want to beat myself over the head because it's difficult to give up sugar. I just am aware that I don't think that the environment has necessarily made it so that's the case. It's contributed. So I've had sugar, and that's got me sort of addicted to it, So the environment does have a part to play. I certainly wouldn't want to discount poverty, difficult circumstances at home with families, absent fathers, I don't know, a whole variety of things that can make life very difficult for inner city children, the ones who I deal with. So those are all very important. But the way we speak to our children is to say there are obstacles in front of you. They are real. I'm not saying they're not real. But what you mustn't do is say, because of those obstacles, that's my life. You have got it inside you to leap over those obstacles. And the more if you're at the top of the pyramid, you are more likely to be able to jump over those obstacles than you are if you haven't got on the pyramid at all. So that I feel it's our responsibility as adults, as teachers, as parents, to help them move up that pyramid so that they are more likely to be successful in life. If, on the other hand, you're sort of more indulgent of this victimhood mentality, however bad your life is, and your life might be terrible. It might be that you've got this very challenging family background. You're not in a very good school, for instance. I mean, obviously, we don't talk to our children about that because we believe we're a great school. But there might be all sorts of things against you. But you've only got the one life. And that you've got to find it within yourself to try and overcome these issues, because otherwise you're going to end up on your deathbed looking back and saying, well, I was born poor, there was nothing I could do, or I was born black, so racism was such that I couldn't make a success in my life. I'm not denying those obstacles exist. I'm just saying the way we approach them has to be with this kind of growth mindset attitude of, I'm going to leap over these obstacles and I am in control of that.
Steve, your thoughts on the balance, I suppose, between acknowledging that there are hardships and there are structural, perhaps, injustices that do weigh on individuals, especially young people. But we also sort of, Katharine says that shouldn't sort of, a victimhood mentality is the danger, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't disagree at all with anything Katharine has said. Within Oasis, we've got other ways of different ways. We all develop our different ways of talking about these things. Just when you talked about Katharine's addiction to sugar, and which you talked about, and you said, is it an evil? I don't think Katharine's addiction to sugar is anything to do with being evil. It's perhaps, as Katharine said, laziness. It's indulgence, etc., exactly for us all, isn't it? We indulge, we are lazy, and our laziness in the end ends up crippling us. That's the thing. I agree with absolutely what Katharine said. I don't know if you both heard of what the psychologists within Oasis, we employ a number of psychologists across the work we're doing, and there's a psychological theory which is called false attribution theory. And it's a very fancy name, isn't it? But it simply means this. When I do something wrong, it's because I had a tough day. It's because I didn't get enough sleep. It's because I'm in debt. It's because I'm not feeling well and I got an awful headache. It's because my car failed its MOT and it put me in a bad mood, etc., etc. When you, Justin or Katharine, do something wrong, it's because you're bad people. False attribution theory. We weigh the behaviour of others on a different scale to the way we weigh our own behaviour. And I agree with what Katharine says. Katharine's talked about a growth mindset. You would both be aware of what get called ACEs now. Adverse childhood experiences. So much to say about that one way or the other. But the truth is, both Katharine and I are working with young people who face not just adverse experiences, but an adverse childhood. Violence, abuse, neglect, lack of food, etc., etc. So when that child turns up to school 5 minutes late, why did they turn up to school 5 minutes later? Tell you a story, absolute true story from just the last couple of months. Young person turning up to one of our secondary schools consistently late, just a few minutes late, sometimes 15 minutes late, 5 minutes late, day after day after day after day. When the situation was looked into, it became clear that during the lockdown, the father had left. The mother was left alone with 3 siblings. She had no money. She turned to prostitution. She turned to alcohol because of the shame she felt about having to bring money into their household that way. This child each morning was getting her mother out of bed, who'd often urinated in the bed, cleaning her mother down, showering her mum, then waking up the 2 younger siblings, showering them, giving them breakfast, taking them to primary school, and then coming on to the secondary school. In other words, as Katharine says, it's not a level playing field for us. is it? And what we've got to do, it's no good wallowing in a victim mentality, this is where I am, but it's how we help young people through the situations they face so that they can excel. So built and baked into Oasis approach is we say we believe that every child should be able to fulfill their God-given potential, and it's our job to assist them in doing that in every way we can.
Yeah, Katharine, what's your approach then? I'm sure you see situations that are very challenging for your young people as well. I mean, to what extent is it about saying, pull your socks up, you're responsible? To what extent is it about saying, no, your situation is the issue, and that's the thing that needs to be addressed primarily?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And that's the difficulty that schools struggle with all of the time. And the other difficulty that you've got to bring in to the conversation is the consistency or inconsistency in approach amongst staff. Because, you've got dozens, if not hundreds of teachers in some schools, and different staff will have different interpretations of things. They'll also have differing amounts of knowledge about the situation that the child might be in. And so it's interesting because the behavior system that we've got here would often be described as no excuses. So and other schools will adopt this kind of thing. It's a no excuses approach. You don't allow children to come up with the excuse of, yeah, but it's because my bus was late. It's because, as Steve went on with the various excuses you can put forward, and then you say, well, it's not my fault. And then the teacher who's talking to them says, oh, poor you, it's okay. I'm not going to give you detention for being late. And of course, for the situation that Steve just described, obviously is a very different situation to a number of situations where children are late, where they would have any number of excuses, which might not be, in the same category. And the difficulty you then have is, so one, there's just the difficulty of, well, when do you say it's okay, you don't have to be on time, and when do you say it's not okay? But then there's the additional point that different people are making that decision because there are different teachers dealing with each situation. So when we call ourselves a no excuses school, in a way it's not entirely true, because there are some times where an excuse would be accepted, but it would only ever be accepted by me. So what I mean is, no teacher in the school is allowed to bend the rules unless that comes through me. And that creates a situation where there is consistency, that there's always one person making that judgment. It's also somebody who's very experienced, who knows all the information there is to know about the child, who's got at her fingertips a lot of information and experience to make the right decision, to be in touch with parents, to be in touch with, support out there, whether that's through the council or wherever. So, it's that's what's important, is that consistency. And also the other thing is the fact that it's quite exceptional, that you're not accepting excuses all of the time. It's quite an exceptional situation that would come to me. And then that means that the children are more likely to climb that pyramid. Now, when I say they're more likely, you need to ask yourselves, how does the school preempt the problem in the first place? And how does the school support your most vulnerable children in achieving the thing that you want them to achieve? So as an example, we say they have to come with their equipment, or for instance, we would give them a detention. And so how do we do that? What's their equipment? How do we make it so they're more likely to? Well, one, they all have the exact same pencil case. And in every class, in every bit of the school, whether you're in year 7 or year 11, they have the same expectation for what's in their pencil case. So it's something that's been built up as a habit over years. And they don't have to think, oh, my science teacher likes me writing in blue pen, but my maths teacher likes me in the black pen, and I need a 2B pencil and all, but I need an HB pencil. They don't need to think like that. It's sorted out for them. And right from the beginning, when they're joining in year 6, the details are gone through, and they know exactly what they need. And so they start off in year 7, every single one of them with the exact same pencil case, and they know exactly what they have to do. Now, in addition to that, so that's one bit of support that we're giving them. The second bit of support is that we have a little school shop that some of the children run. And in the morning, they're there with their little pens and their rulers and all the things that they need. So if, for instance, a child were to forget his pen and not checked his bag the night before, he can come in the morning and he can get that from the school shop. In addition to that, we also sell to parents a kind of pack with all kinds of repeats of the various pens that they need and so on, so that that's at home. So if they are checking it in the evening, they can say, oh, my pen isn't working anymore. I can put that pen in there and it's right there. So we've thought, and we've given all kinds of checklists to the parents, had meetings with parents. So all of that has happened. We've thought about every detail on how to support, which means it makes it extremely likely that they are going to deliver. When I say deliver, they're going to show up with all of their equipment. But it's important that the school give them that support, because what ends up happening when you don't give them that support is that your most vulnerable kids are the ones, and the most vulnerable ones are the ones who come from challenging backgrounds and so on. They're the ones who will not be able to meet that. But
the expectation, as it were, is the same. It's just that the support may be slightly different in order to help them meet that expectation. Steve. So
I've got various comments to make about what Katharine said. The first thing is that you could therefore say that Oasis runs no excuse schools. But the point is, if there's an excuse, it's an excuse. If there's a reason, there's a reason. And so what we're not interested in excuses, but what we work very hard at is to ask, what are the reasons behind this child's behaviour? Behind them showing up without a pencil case or the right pens, etc., etc. So again, in our schools, across most of them, if you come without the right shoes on or without the right shirt, etc., we run shops, but not to buy things, but we give you a shirt, we give you a blazer, we give you the shoes that you need for that day, because we don't want to make judgments about a child's situation. Having said that, what we are able to do, because Oasis is now a vast organisation, is we have community youth workers and community family workers. This is nothing to do with the educational budget. So Katharine's school and most schools just can't afford those things. So through completely different routes, because we ran all of this before, we have legal teams, we have debt advice teams, we have family workers, we have psychologists, we have therapists. So we're constantly working around the whole family. We're working with the mums and the dads, etc., etc., because that way you can get closer in. In actual fact, in the education white paper and the education green paper just out 3 weeks ago, there's a big emphasis on moving towards this. How do you reach a place where you don't exclude any children from education? And a wing of Oasis, which we call the Commission on Young Lives, which is headed by the former Children's Commissioner Anne Longfield, reported just last week. So that's Oasis work again, really. And we're pushing for inclusion all the time rather than exclusions. So we know that once a child is excluded from school, if they're constantly isolated, if they're in school but they're in, out of mainstream, if they're constantly pushed out into the corridor, if they're constantly in detention, etc., all of the evidence from something called the Timpson report, which was produced at the beginning of the first lockdown, all the way through, government's own statistics show that you're less likely to achieve, you're more likely to be exploited, you're more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. 86% of all young people involved in the criminal justice system at any level have been formally excluded from school. If it's just a series of fixed term exclusions, temporary exclusions, if it's a managed move to another school. So we talk constantly, don't we, about kids that are hard to work with and hard to reach. Actually, I genuinely do believe, inside every child there's a desire to grow and a desire to learn. And what we've got to do is tap into it. Who was that famous educationist who said, if the child doesn't learn the way you teach, start teaching the way they learn? So that's what we're about. I'd say one last thing. Our ethos and our curriculum are based around three things: competency, which is what Catherine's talking about, your maths and your English, etc., your physics. By the way, the one comment I got from one of our students whose dad works for Oasis, so he had access to my diary, and she spoke to me on Sunday. She goes to the same church as I do. She's in one of our sixth forms that concentrate on STEM things, and she said, "Do tell Katharine girls are very good at physics." So I said that for Rosie now. But our curriculum is built around three things: competency, community, working together, and character, and all of that is built around what we call the Oasis 9 habits. Because I agree with Katharine, you've got to develop the right habits in life, and the Oasis 9 habits are actually just in the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians. So we have these 9 habits, our curriculum, our training for our early start teachers, our middle teachers, middle leaders, our senior leaders, our national leaders, our international leaders, is all based around the Oasis 9 habits: to be passionate, patient, humble, joyful, honest, etc.
Let's allow Katharine to respond to some of that, because in a sense there may be aspects of Steve's educational philosophy you agree with there, Katharine, areas where maybe you'd push back a bit. I'd just be interested in your response to sort of that kind of child-led sort of way of doing education, which as far as Steve's concerned is simply bringing out the innate kind of desire to learn, that's always there in a child. I don't know if you'd agree with that necessarily.
Yeah, I always say that children go to school to learn. All of them. Even the most, badly behaved child, whatever it is, they all go to school to learn. And it's our duty to make sure that we are supporting them and teaching them in a way that makes it so that they can learn. I would just say as well, I never said anything about girls not being able to teach.
I know that. As Katharine pointed out, that was just the media picking it up.
It was taken out of context, your comments on that.
Also, I never even said that about our girls. I said about what my girls wanted to do. I just said what their interests were. I didn't say anything about not being able to do it.
As indeed.
The physics department at the time when those girls were choosing was female. All of my teachers were female that taught physics. So, we in 2019, our results were that we had the best maths department in the country. We had the third best science department in the country. So this idea that somehow my children are not able to choose physics is just silly. Not only not being able to choose it, but not being capable. I've never said anything. I mean, about what women are not capable of. Look, I am a woman. I believe I'm very capable. This is ridiculous. I don't think I'm not very bright. I mean, this is mad.
The truth is, of course, this whole discussion about original sin was equally to do with tweets taken out of context.
Well, but I do want to return to this idea of what's at the core of who we are, because something I've noticed in recent years in education is a real move away from describing, for instance, children as naughty, rather to say their choices are poor. Let's say that I see that a lot in my own kids' education and so on. And there's a sense in which we want to sort of move away from sort of talking about the innate person, if you like, and more talk about their choice and so on. What do you think of that, Katharine? Because that seems to me to feed into this whole question of, are we sort of born bad or born, innately good? And the original sin is effectively saying, well, the flaw, if you like, the badness is there, mixed in with probably some goodness. We're kind of flawed. We're not born perfect. And to that extent, what's your approach to saying would you ever describe a child as naughty, or would you say you've made poor choices? What's your approach to that?
Of course you need to talk about making poor choices. I mean, look, the fact that I've given up sugar demonstrates that it is possible. Obviously, all children, the whole point about this pyramid means that everybody can get to the top. Mm-hmm. If you're saying this is what you are, you're down at the bottom and you'll always be at the bottom. I mean, what kind of teacher does that? That's crazy. Sure. Of course you're talking about how you're moving them up. And the whole point is the school and the teachers, you need to support and encourage. And how is it that you are scaffolding them so that they can get to the top? You need to believe that they'll get to the top. It is simply true that they can get to the top. I mean, the fact that it's more difficult, I do believe it's more difficult. It's more difficult to do your homework. It's much easier not to do your homework. But that doesn't mean you can't get to the point of doing your homework. There are various obstacles in front of you. Some children have more obstacles in front of them than others because they have more difficult home lives, because they, are not, some kids are in really great schools. Some kids are not in such good schools. There are a whole variety of obstacles that differ between children. But that doesn't mean that we then say, oh, well, I'm a victim, we give up. We see our job as adults to try and encourage them to get to the top of that pyramid. And part of that is saying you made the wrong choice. And I'm not going to give up on you in this case. I'm not going to say, you know what, I'm not giving you the detention because, at the end of the day, I have lower standards for you because you come from the estate down the road and you have a single mom. So I'm not going to expect the same out of you as I expect of little Johnny over here, whose parents are together and who lives in a nice house around the corner. I'm not going to do that because if I lower my standards for you, then in the end, when you're 25 and you're functionally illiterate and functionally enumerate, I'm part of the reason why you are functionally illiterate and functionally enumerate. That I have to make the compassionate choice, which is to give you the detention. It's the compassionate choice because I'm thinking of who you will be in the future. I'm not thinking about that moment where I'm thinking, oh, I feel bad about giving you a detention because I know how difficult.
It's a form of tough love, effectively, Katharine, is what you're talking about. Go on. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think this all goes to a question, doesn't it, in the end, about what is education, and Katharine's emphasised homework and detentions and things for not doing your homework. I think within Oasis we have a different view about what education is, and I think I've pointed to that because I've talked about competency and I've talked about community and I've talked about character. It's about the development of those three things. Put differently, I think much of our education system, our exam system, is about what's in your head, and we've not emphasised your hands, what you do, what you can make. And some kids learn that way, or what's in your heart. So you can rise to very senior roles in this country and lie persistently, can't you? So you've developed competency without character. So I think one of the things I think we should do is look at that. And what I would say is we find across Oasis, our schools, again, which, just outperform other schools, and it's just extraordinary. I was in one of our schools this time last week, in a really poor community of North London, really poor community. We take kids from the age of 2 all the way through to 18. 93% of the kids in our sixth form go to a Russell Group university, which is astonishing, because before that school, we've been there 15 years now, but before that school, a significant proportion of kids would have ended up in the justice system. They're now ending up at Oxford and Cambridge. But the fuel of that is a sense of purpose in life, of moral purpose in life. I'm here to contribute something to humanity. And it's that drives our 9 habits and drives our curriculum. So it's a vision of what you can be as a person, and learning becomes part of that.
We're going to go to a quick break, and we'll be back with more from Katharine Birbalsingh and Steve Chalke in just a moment. We're talking about education here on Unbelievable. Not something we discuss very often, but we're doing it sort of in a theological framework. We've started with the whole question of original sin versus original goodness, and maybe we'll return to that as we close out today's discussion. But we'll be back in just a moment's time. I've never met a non-believer. Don't get me wrong, I've met thousands of atheists and skeptics, but even the most non-religious people can still have a holy cause, ritual ceremonies, sacred symbols, and even their own heretics. You see, we're all believers deep down. We all believe that good must conquer evil and that justice really matters. But whether you're on the left or right, religion without grace quickly turns into culture wars and cancellation. We're all believers deep down, but we're worshipping the wrong things. Only with God at the centre and the grace of Jesus guiding us can the power of the Spirit transform culture and bring true justice. At this year's Unbelievable conference, join me, Justin Briley, along with 10 leading thinkers who'll help you speak with truth and grace into our confused and divided culture. Join us on Saturday the 14th of May in person or online from anywhere in the world, and let's unmute God. Book your place at unbelievable.live. We've had a really interesting discussion today. It's been on the question of original sin. Katharine Birbalsingh, by the way, if you want to follow her on Twitter, it's at Miss_Snuffy. Michaela.education for the website for the Michaela Community School that she founded and is the headmistress of. Steve can be found at Steve Chalke on Twitter, oasiscommunitylearning.org for more about their academies and so on. I mean, to a large extent, you know, what you're both after is flourishing children who do well in life, who go on to be able to, you know, be able to control their destiny and everything else and not see themselves as a victim of circumstance. Now, it strikes me you've got different kind of ways of approaching that as to where the emphasis is going to be between the two of you. Katharine, I suppose in the end, you know, going back to that original sin tweet, it feels to me like your concern in education today is that it's possible to kind of ignore the reality of human nature, and that you want people to be realistic about who we are and the kind of the flaws that we inhabit, and not to see every sort of child as sort of just some squished down, you know, otherwise if it weren't for the wrongs of society they would be this wonderful blooming person. That there's a symbiosis in that sense between who we are as flawed people and the culture we exist in. So you know, what's your pitch? What's if there is a distinction between you and Steve? Where might the difference lie as to kind of how you see your job of habituating those habits in children and being realistic, I suppose, about the human nature they have?
Yeah, well, I would say everything he talked about with regard to character that Steve just said. I totally agree. The number one thing that I'm proud of at the school is the people who our children are. It's not their exam results. We are very much about the whole child. And it's one of the reasons why I always invite people to come and visit school and have lunch with the children and have a tour, because they get to talk to the children then and see what their characters are like. I 100% agree with Steve that in order to lead a successful life, you need to develop children's character, and that your moral character and who you are is really important. So I 100% agree with that. I suppose the difference, I'm not sure. The difference is that I believe that teachers need to be leading that and that we need to be preempting and scaffolding and supporting children to reach the aim of whether it's their good character or whether it's good academic results and so on. Whatever it is you want, you are supporting them to get there and you're holding them to account. So, you know, detention is no big deal at Michaela. You know, it's not, everyone gets detention and it's kind of no big deal. You know, you just go along, you do your 20 minutes, you do a bit of work and then you go home and who cares, you know? And when that happens, it's good because it just means everything's fair. You never hear at Michaela, oh, that's not fair. So-and-so did that and he got away with it. And why can't I get away with it? You know, that never in the whole time, 8 years, never heard that. It's not fair here. And the children don't just accept it. They love the systems and being held to account. They love the tight hold that the security that they feel in that environment. And I think what people often mistakenly think about us is that somehow squashes creativity or thinking for yourself. And I would argue that it's actually quite the opposite. That when you give children security, it's then when they feel empowered to think outside the box, to express their opinions, to go, you know, the extra mile, because they know that they have that security of consistency across all of the teachers in terms of our approach on behavior, but also in terms of our expectations. And that allows them the freedom to be able to expect more of themselves. That is what I would argue, but that much of what I'm arguing is often not obvious. You know, it's you have to take the back route in order to get the thing that you want, is what I'd say. And that's just now, that's always the case, which is why I always struggle to get my ideas out. And in a tweet, well, forget about it because it's so short. And actually, these issues are really quite complex. And there's a lot of unpicking.
Yeah, as Katharine says there, Steve, it's ultimately you both want the same thing for the kids, and there may just be a difference in the way that the philosophy that works that out. I mean, you've talked all along about this idea that you don't like the idea of original badness, which is what you see sort of original sin as, that if we're going to use any kind of Christian framework to talk about kids, it's about being made in the image of God, loved, and that's ultimately the thing that we should hold up. And I suppose it's about, you know, in a way, I think Katharine, even if she doesn't necessarily agree with the theological metaphysical side of that, would say yes, absolutely, humans are valued and loved, and we need to bring out the best in them. In the end, I mean, for you, what are you hopeful for the educational system in the UK? Do you think it's moving in the direction of being able to bring out the best in children and so on? Is our Oasis Academies and indeed the Michaela Community School an exception to the norm, or do you think things are going in the right direction?
I'd say this: there's nothing that Katharine said that I disagree with at all. You know, there's not. I disagree with John Calvin, not Katharine. So fundamentally disagree with him because I think he had a warped theology. That's it. So, but bring that down to practicalities. We have loads of kids in our schools who've been told they don't count. They're told they're not nurtured, they're not cared for, they're not cuddled, they're not read to. They've been just rejected, pushed aside, whatever it is. We've got lots of children like that, as I'm sure Katharine does as well. And the last thing they need to know is that they are totally, they live in total depravity, that they're under the wrath of God, that they're sinful and broken. What we're teaching them is the opposite. We're teaching them that their life is special. I was fortunate enough when I was a kid, I went to a dump of a school, but I was fortunate enough when I was a kid to stumble along to a youth group in a church, which is why I'm a Christian really. And these youth workers, young people they looked old to me at the time, but I subsequently discovered they were only in their early 20s. They told me my life had purpose, that I could achieve exactly what Katharine's saying. And I was gripped by that because in my school, I was told that I didn't count. You won't get far, chalk, they used to say. You'll work with your hands, not your head. They said it to us all, by the way. It wasn't just picking on me. It was a secondary modern school. You won't do O-levels, GCSEs, because it's not worth submitting you to them. You wouldn't pass them. So all through my young life, I was constantly told I wasn't good enough. I wasn't good enough. And I went to a church with my parents when I was a kid, and I listened to this doctrine pushed out week after week. I was a sinner. I wasn't worthy. And then I found this other church with this wonderful youth group, and they told me my life had purpose and meaning, that I was created by God and that God loved me. And that's what turned my life around. You can't harm somebody to help them. That's what I say. Harming people doesn't help them. I don't believe that Jesus was a stick person. He was a carrot person. He looked at people, he smiled at people who were outcast, pushed aside by the social leaders and the religious leaders. He had tea with them, he had meals with them, he encouraged them he encouraged them to follow him. And by the way, I agree absolutely with what Katharine says about the role of the teacher in all of this. I think we've ended up in British society with a kind of diminished view of teaching. I often say, if you're in a maths lesson, if it's a good lesson, you might learn something about maths. You will learn something about maths. But even if it's a bad maths lesson, you'll learn a lot about being an adult, about the way an adult responds to teenagers, about when someone gets something wrong, how that's dealt with, etc., etc. You're learning all the time, aren't you? We're learning all the time. And so I think that the role of a teacher is to be a guide, an example, a role model. That's important. And that's why the character stuff we teach begins with our staff. So all our staff are constantly working at this stuff for their own lives and themselves.
Katharine, as we start to close this out, any responses there to Steve's perspective?
Well, I mean, I agree that, I don't believe in God, but children need to be loved. You need to immerse them in love, and they need to know that the reason why you're giving them the detention is because you love them and you're holding your standards high. You're also, as I said on my little chart, it's not like you're only giving out demerits. Mm-hmm. You've also got the merits, mm-hmm. right? So you're doing both. You're saying if you make the wrong choice, this is the consequence. If you make the right choice, then here's the merit. And that you do that for a while until eventually it's just what they do without thinking about it. It just becomes part of who they are. And that's what growing up is. And if you have the right kind of support from family and from your teachers, you're going to very likely be in that position at the end where you're just the kind of person who turns up on time and you bring your equipment and you're polite to people and you do all the things are asked for of you. And when you end up in a job later and they give you some project to go away and do at home, you don't think, oh, I can't be bothered. It's just who you are. You do it, you deliver, your boss is really pleased with you. That ultimately is what we want for our kids. We want them to be kind, decent people who can live honest and fruitful lives. And that's what we're trying to do. So, I don't know. I suppose people have different approaches.
And I'd say, Justin, all this plays back into that Genesis story, Genesis chapter 3, because as all the rabbis and the scribes before them have taught through Jewish history, that the story of Adam and Eve and the talking snake, the devil's not mentioned there, and the doctrine of the devil, as I'm sure you'll know, wasn't developed until at least 500 years after this story was first written down. The talking snake and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's a story about moral development, growing up morally, and it's a story all about not surrendering to our initial appetites. And the fact is that when Adam and Eve surrender to their appetite, like Katharine used to surrender to sugar, like I surrender to sitting on a couch instead of going out for a run, it's all the same, isn't it? The hard thing to do is the best thing, always. The easy thing to do is the thing that is neglectful. And the story is about not surrendering to your appetites, your initial appetites. And it ends, doesn't it, as you'll know, Justin, it ends with Adam and Eve having to leave, the first man and the first woman in this fable, this piece of mythology. It ends with them having to leave the Garden of Paradise and innocence, where everything is always right as rain, and they end up living, as you'll know, east of Eden. That's where we get that phrase from. And every time I choose my appetite over what's best, I end up a little bit east of paradise, a little bit further away from the best. That's what the story's saying.
Yeah. But ultimately, Steve, obviously we, as a Christian, you also believe in a God of grace who bring, despite our failings, as it were, brings us into his presence and gives us the ability to ultimately choose the right thing. I mean, Katharine, just to end with you, I mean, you're not a Christian, and you probably didn't realize the theological can of worms you were opening when you tweeted that thing about original sin. But it's interesting that, I mean, do you think that faith has a part to play in education, in the sense that if you are an atheist, if you're someone who believes that ultimately the world is just about material causes and, whatever happens, where does, I suppose, that intrinsic view you have that actually children have this innate deep worth, this value, if it's not from a sort of a faith, is it just something you see as sort of obvious in the way that I suppose you see the flaws are also obvious in human nature?
Well, it's a good question. I would say I was agnostic rather than atheist. And I suppose my parents were Christian, and I was brought up going to church, and I didn't go to the church that Steve was talking about. I went to the church where they told me that God loved me. And so I know all the Bible stories and all that. And I think they're really great. I think I think they teach children lots of good. I'm grateful for my upbringing, and going to church. But it's a good question, why is it that I believe in this innate worth and so on? Possibly it's just the vestiges of Christianity in our society, that's what I've just kind of come to believe. And if Christianity hadn't had the influence over our country, as it were, over Western thought, that I wouldn't think naturally in that kind of way. I suspect that's probably why. The whole business of, Jesus rising from the dead and all of that, I believe in lots that Christianity puts forward in terms of ideas. The whole business of rising from the dead does, escapes me a little. That's where I kind of got to when I go, I'm not sure I can believe that. But, and that's because I'm a child of the late 20th century and I sort of don't have time. I'm too busy running my school to do a degree in theology and explore all of these ideas properly. But one day, if I ever retire, I'll explore it. And who knows what might happen.
Well, maybe we'll get you back on at some point to talk about that. But in any case, it's been great to have you on, Katharine, and Steve as well. Thank you both for a really interesting discussion that's ranged far and wide. But again, I'll make sure there are links from today's show to you both where people can find out more. But for now, thanks for being with me on today's show.
Thank you, Katharine.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.